All right, so welcome everybody to the Automation for Jira's second webinar. So this one is entitled How to Create Powerful Rules with Smart Values. And in this one, we're going to be going into a lot more depth than we did last week in some of the things that makes Automation for Jira that bit more powerful. So before I do get started, first of all, skip ahead. Before I do get started, just wanted to first say thanks very much for attending. As ever, it's 8 a.m. here in Sydney. We've got our copy with us. Andreas is typing away answers to your questions there. I'll introduce him in a second. If you did attend last week, you sort of know the drill, so we'll just rush through that. If you didn't, we have that video recorded, and I'm going to send that to you guys afterwards as well. Equally, if there's anything in this video that you missed, don't worry, we're recording everything, and we're going to send that to you as well. So a little bit of housekeeping, just as we wait for the last people to come along. Any questions you have, and we hope this loads, that's what this is all about, pop them through the Q&A section of the Zoom software that you see there. It's just easier for us to go through those questions rather than in the chat box at the end. And other than that, I think it's time for us to get started. So I'm hoping we just had to move room at the last minute because there was some builders that just walked in on us in our usual room. So if anything happens, not our fault. All right, let's kick inwards and start by introducing ourselves. So that's me there on the left with the bicycle, tending to be healthy. My name is John Kiernan. I'm the marketing guy in Automation for Jira. Before this, I was a travel writer, and I also had a stint working as Santa Claus in London, which was very rewarding. And this to my left is Andreas.
Hey everyone. Yeah, I'm one of the co-founders here at CodeBarrel, the company behind Automation for Jira. So Nick and I, my other co-founder, started CodeBarrel about 3 years ago. But before that, both of us worked at Atlassian for about 10 years. And pretty much we worked on Jira for the entire time for those 10 years. Just to give you a bit of background of where this idea of automation came from. So while we worked at Atlassian, we always kicked around this idea that there's a whole lot more we wanted to do with Jira, but also there's a lot of little manual tasks that we kept repeating, and we thought that surely there's some way to automate this, so to do this in a better way. But while we were at Atlassian, we could never get that onto an official roadmap. So then 3 years ago, when we left, we started working on this idea, and that's really where Automation for Jira comes from. And I guess we're pretty happy that we now have a successful app in the marketplace, and we can actually run advanced webinars about it. So I'll hand over back to John to introduce the rest of this webinar today.
All right. So again, I'm only going to speak for another 2 or 3 minutes or so. Just want to sort of reiterate that we're not going to be just going through a PowerPoint. The goal is for you guys to take away, actionable things that you can do to improve your automation in Jira. So what I'm going to do is just go through 1 or 2 more slides, then I'll hand over to Andreas, and he's actually going to jump straight into Automation for Jira. And show you how to do things within the rules, which is the best way to learn. Right, so to give you an idea of what you should be walking away with at the end of this, if you are a beginner, some of this might be a bit dense, but you'll get there eventually. If not, this should be pretty good for you guys. So at the end, you should sort of have the difference between what's a project and a global rule, why they're there, what the power of each is. We'll cover that fairly briefly. Related issues is super powerful. So as you probably know, Jira is highly customizable, sometimes complex. So no issues ever exist in isolation. And one of the great things that Automation for Jira does is allow you to work across all sorts of things. So we're going to spend a bit of time on that too. And then it's the big ones, so smart values. This is really what gives a huge amount of power to Automation for Jira. And we're going to really spend most of the time on that. So the webinar all up will probably be 35 to 40 minutes. And then after that, we'll leave time for questions, so 20 to 30 minutes, depending on questions. As ever, though, we'll leave all those questions till the end. Doesn't mean you have to stop, just keep asking those questions. Once I stop talking, I'm going to go and just formulate them all, get them ready for Andreas at the end when he's finished his coffee. And I know Andreas is going to roll his eyes at this one, but I always go over this metaphor that when I started with Automation for Jira, putting rules together for me was just like building blocks. That was the easiest way for me to learn as someone who didn't really know much about Jira or have a particularly technical background. So I always just figured it was like building blocks. What we do in Jira is just use triggers, conditions, and actions. A little bit more complex than that, but that's essentially the building blocks that we do. Now today, what we're going to be doing is going nuts and just showing how we could take those building blocks and just make them work in magical ways. It took me quite a long time to find this GIF, so it's really the only reason I want to include it in the slide. But that's essentially what we're going to be doing today, is showing the superpowers that we can get from this. Okay, very last before I hand over to the brains, a little bit of last homework. So housework, there's no homework. So if you might be on server, you might be on cloud, you might be on the light version, you might be on the paid pro version. It doesn't really matter. We've set this webinar up so everybody should be able to get the same thing out of it. One thing to note is we do have all of the rules that we're going to set up today. Just like last week, we're putting them into the rule playground. That goes for anybody watching this recording afterwards as well. You can go in and see these exact rules and just go and steal it. That's what I always do. I just steal Andreas's good work. So just follow that link there at the top and you'll see the rule playground. But other than that, it's time for us to get started. So I will hand over to Andreas and I'll be answering your questions and I'll talk to you in about half an hour.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, so let's actually jump out of the slides and into automation. Right, so just briefly before I actually dive into automation, I'll show you the rule playground one more time. And actually, before I do that, I need to dock this window to a different spot. Oops. Sorry, John, do you know? Oh, no, it's okay. I figured it out. I managed to control Zoom myself. It's all good. Okay, so we're on our public docs site. So you don't need Jira installed for this. This is the bit that John mentioned. And this is in fact our rule playground. And on the left here, there's all the rules that we covered in last week's webinar, but also the rules that we will cover today. So let's actually jump in and start chatting about our first topic. So the first topic we'll cover is explaining project versus global rules. So first of all, before I show you how you configure project versus global rules, I wanted to explain a little bit more about why we need them in the first place. So with Jira and with automation for Jira in particular, there's a lot of different use cases. So there's a lot of different automation use cases that we can cover, and not all of them are the same. Sometimes it might make sense to automate something just very specifically in a particular project. So for example, you might have a software project in which you're managing releases. So say if a version's released, you might want to move all the issues that are assigned to that version to done with an automation rule. Now that rule really only makes sense in a software project. So that would probably be a project-specific rule that only applies in that project. But then there's a lot of other types of automation use cases that work and can save you time across all of your projects. So for example, you might have an automation rule that when an issue is transitioned through the workflow, it will assign that issue to the user who performed the transition. And that's something that would be useful in your software projects, it might be useful in your Jira core projects, or even in a service desk project potentially. And so for those rules, you'd probably want to create them as a global rule that applies across all of your projects. And the really nice thing about this is that you only have to create this rule once, and all that automation functionality and goodness is being reused across all of your projects. And you don't have to create the same rule over and over again in all of your different projects. And that's really the main idea behind project versus global rules. So let's take a quick look at how this actually works in practice. So here we are in the project settings page of automation for Jira. So you can just visit any project settings in your projects and then jump to the project automation section on the left. And then you get this rule list that shows you all the rules from this particular webinar's project that we're in here. So this was in fact all the rules that we created in our webinar last week, if you happen to be watching. Now, if you wanted to create or see global rules, we also have a global admin section. So if you're a global administrator, which currently the user that I'm logged in as is a global admin, then you can actually jump to the system tab in the global admin section and navigate down to automation rules on the left. And then you'll actually see all the project rules. So the 4 rules that we had in our project before, plus we also get to see this one global rule that I've configured here. Doesn't really do anything, but this is a rule that would apply in all projects in this Jira instance. Now, one thing that's maybe a little bit interesting for people new to automation is that, in fact, if I change my filters on the left here in our project admin section, then I can actually see this global rule in here as well. And the reason we decided to show you global rules in the project admin section is that these rules will potentially cause issues to be edited in this project. And so we felt it was important to show the project administrators of this project any rule that might touch issues in this project. And so if this global rule performs some changes, then project administrators can actually go in here and look at the audit log and check if there was any executions that edited issues in here. Now, right now I'm logged in as a global administrator. So I can administrate projects and I can do global admin stuff. And that means I can actually also go ahead and edit this rule in the project admin section because I have permission to. However, one thing to note with project versus global rules is that there are different access levels. So if I, for example, log in as a project administrator only, so right now in this new window here, I'm actually logged in just as a project administrator, and then I actually go to look at this global rule again, I can still see the rule, because as I mentioned, we want to communicate to project admins that there is global rules performing changes in your project. However, when you try to edit them, they're in read-only mode, and a project administrator cannot actually change this rule. And when you go to the rule details, there's a little notification at the top here to tell you that this rule is read-only, and you need to be a global administrator to actually edit a multi-project rule or a global rule. And so this is a concept that we'll cover a little bit later in our next rule. But effectively, one thing to know as well is that project-specific rules, so the ones that we have in this project already, can only perform changes on issues within the same project. And we'll cover this, as I mentioned, in our next rule in a little bit more detail. But for now, just to jump back and show you the last little bit here, you might be wondering, how can I change the scope of a rule, whether it's a project-specific rule or whether it's a global rule? So you don't actually have to go and recreate a rule from scratch if you want to change this, but you do have to log in as a global administrator in the global admin section. And then if you visit the rule details, you will see this restrict to projects field here. And that's really how you can control the project versus global scope. So right now this field is blank, which means this is a global rule. And so when an issue is updated from any project in this Jira instance, this rule would execute. However, you can very quickly here limit this to be project specific. So right now, this rule would only execute when an issue is updated in my webinars project, or you could even make it a multi-project rule. So right now, this rule would only execute in these 2 projects. So it's very quick and easy to change this. And as I mentioned, we'll jump into an actual practical example when we look at our first real world rule that you can use in your own Jira instance at home. But that's pretty much it for global versus project rules. So just to recap, it's a really quick way to have automation rules that are very limited in scope and only apply to one project, but you can also create automation rules that have shared functionality that apply in all of your projects. So you don't have to recreate the same automation rule over and over again. All right, so let's move on to our next topic, which is dealing with linked issues. So this is something that's very powerful, and it's a really useful part of automation for Jira. And it's something that we already touched on in our first webinar last week, if you happen to be watching that. So the rule that we looked at last week was this rule here, where when a subtask was moved to done, we would move up to the parent issue with this related branch rule. And this is really the bit that we're going to look at in a bit more detail now. And then if all the other subtasks under this parent were done as well, then we would transition the parent itself to done. So while this is a very useful use case, and we actually have a lot of customers using this particular rule, I wanted to show you another example today to explain the power of this related issues branch a little bit more today. So we're going to create a new rule from scratch today for this particular use case. So the example we're going to cover today is if you're using Jira for software development as well as for providing customer support. So a very common use case is that our customers would have a software project in which they track all the bugs and features and improvement requests. And then there would be a separate Jira Service Desk project where support staff are dealing with customer queries. And then if a support case results in a bug being raised in the software project, then usually support staff would link those together. And so over time, the bugs and improvements in your support project would have many support cases linked to them. Now, one thing that would be really nice is if we could notify all of our customers in support when that software issue is resolved. So when we've closed off a feature, we want to let people know, hey, you could upgrade and get this latest feature. And that's something that we do ourselves in our service desk. So I wanted to show you today how you can build such a rule. So we'll jump straight into our rule builder. And in this case, we will pick the issue transition trigger. And in fact, we will run this rule when an issue is moved to done. Oops, picked the wrong status there. So basically, when a software issue is resolved, we want to notify all the linked support issues. So the next thing we need to do is we need to find a way to get to the linked issues. So we can pick this branch rule and related issues component again. So with this, you have quite a lot of different ways that you can find related issues to the trigger issue. So you can look for the subtasks if the trigger issue was a parent issue, or if the trigger issue was a subtask itself, you can navigate up to the parent. Perhaps if you're in a software context, if the trigger issue was an epic, then you can navigate to all the stories in that epic and perform changes on those stories. Maybe you want to resolve all the stories. And there's quite a lot of different options available here to find related issues. But for today, we're just going to go with linked issues because we want to find all the linked issues in our support project. And then we're going to add a comment to our support issue to basically let our customers know that we've basically shipped a fix for the issue that triggered this rule, please upgrade, and so on. Now, one thing you'll see in this comment here is that there is actually quite a few smart values. Ignore those for now. We'll cover those in the last section of this webinar. Just rest assured that when this rule runs, it will actually replace this with the reporter's name and this part down here with the trigger issue key. But we'll cover these in more detail later. So the way this rule is right now, it's not really quite correct yet. Because the problem is, this is a global rule. We're in the global admin section here. And right now, this rule would run when any issue is transitioned to done. So whether that's a software issue, whether that's a support issue, it wouldn't quite work. But we said we only want to run this rule if the issue that's transitioned was in fact a software issue. So we need to add an additional condition here to check that the issue that's being transitioned is in fact a software issue. So we've got a SOF project here. And then there's still yet another thing we have to add to this rule. So the problem with this linked issues branch right now is that a software issue might be linked to more than just support issues. It might also be linked to other software issues, or it could be linked to issues in completely different projects that we don't care about. But we only want to notify support issues. So we need to insert another condition in this rule to ensure that the linked issues are in our support project down on this branch. So that then when we get to this comment action, we only have linked support issues. And that's really it. So now we're ready to publish this rule. So we'll give it a nice little name. And then let's actually go ahead and try this rule out. So let's jump to a software issue that I prepared earlier. So here we've got a nice little software feature that's currently in progress to implement an awesome little feature. And we've got a support project that we link to here where customers has asked for some help that resulted in this feature being raised. So let's go ahead and actually move this to done and then jump across to the support project. And you can see here that we've now added a comment telling this customer, hey, the reporter, hey, John, we just wanted to let you know that we just shipped a fix for this software one issue and they can now go ahead and upgrade. And if we jump back to our automation rule, we can see that there's a successful execution here. The issue that triggered the rule was our software issue, which passed our condition. It is a software issue. And then we jumped into our branch, which is our support issue, which also passed. It was a support issue, and then we added a comment. So nice and simple. Now, some of you watching might be wondering, why did we not just apply a project context to this? Why did we have to specify these conditions? So as I mentioned earlier, we could have actually made this a project-specific rule so that it only runs in the software project. Now, this is partially correct right now. So this would certainly work in the sense that this rule would now only trigger if an issue in the software project is transitioned. So effectively, we wouldn't need this condition. However, the problem is around permissions. So I mentioned earlier that project-specific rules can only action issues within the same project that the rule is restricted to. So that means that for this linked issues branch, this branch will then only be able to find linked issues from the software project as well. And it wouldn't be able to find any issues from the support project, because this rule is specific to the software project. And we made sure that when we wrote automation for Jira, that automation rules cannot be used for malicious users or admins to escalate their permissions and potentially perform changes in projects that they don't have permission for. So one thing we should probably do here is also add the support project to our scope. So now this rule will be triggered by any issue in the software or support project, and then it can actually perform changes and find linked issues in the support project as well. So you can either leave this rule as a global rule, or you have to make it a multi-project rule to deal with this scenario of actioning issues in two related projects. All right. So that's pretty much it for related issues. So I just wanted to show you one more time, if you're trying to follow along at home, you can actually just go to our docs at automationforjira.com. And if you select this webinars to label, once you're in the rule playground, then you can actually see the rules that we will cover today. So there is this notify support issues rule that we just created, in fact, in our Jira instance here. And you can go ahead, play around with it, and add more actions and see if you can customize this for your specific use case. All right, let's jump ahead to the last and probably by far the most interesting section of this advanced webinar, and that is smart values. So before I jump in and show you some smart values, I figured it'd be good to actually cover the basics and just tell you a little bit more about why we have smart values in the first place. What do we use them for? So with automation rules, quite often it makes sense to utilize some of the data that you have in your issues. So for example, if you're setting up an automation rule that sends an email to several people in your organization, you might want to include some things about that issue that the automation rule is running for in the email. So you might want to include the issue key, the issue summary, maybe you want to include the priority and who it's assigned to right now. And that's really the purpose of smart values. It's a way for you to access any information stored in an issue, so any fields, system fields, custom fields, and so on, and include that in your actions in automation for Jira, so that you can actually use all the information that's on an issue. Now, before we jump into some examples, I just wanted to show you the part of our docs that's most relevant here. So I will prefix this section where smart values can become quite complex, and it's probably one of the most powerful features of automation for Jira. And they can be a little bit confusing to use. Now we know that there's some improvements to be made here, and in future we'll most likely ship some improvements like a smart values autocomplete or some kind of builder. But for now, you kind of have to know a little bit of the background of when you're trying to use smart values. Now, the good news is that we have very detailed docs around this. So if you jump into this working with issue data in our documentation, you'll get a bit of an overview of how smart values work. Plus, we have many, many examples for how you can access different fields in Jira and how you can pull different data out of issues. So, we give you plenty of examples here for issue data. There's also information about how to pull fields from users, for example, the reporter, and so on. And our docs should really have enough examples to probably cover 80 to 90% of the use cases that you will have to perform with smart values. So let's actually jump into an automation rule and show you how you can figure out smart values. So I'm going to show you a rule here that we use ourselves all the time for debugging smart values, or just any rule. So for this rule, I'm going to use a special trigger that we have in automation for Jira, which is the manual trigger. So what this trigger does is it actually just adds a button on the view issue page to run this automation rule for that particular issue. And then we can configure pretty much any action we want. And today I'm going to use another special little action that we have here, which is this log action to help me debug smart values. So one thing I can do here is I can simply try out my smart values. So I'm going to try some smart values that we just saw in our docs. For example, the issue key and the summary. So I can save this, give it a quick name, like our debugging rule, turn this on. And now if I jump to an issue and reload this issue, if you go to the issue operations here, you'll see that there's a new little button here, which is basically the rule name. And when I click this, it will simply execute this little rule that I've just created. And when I jump to the audit log, I can see that it executed for the issue. And in fact, on the left here, our log action has already printed the smart values that are entered for that issue in the audit log. So you can very quickly try out different smart values to see if they work and if you've got the correct thing in there before you actually configure your real actions. But you can even take this a step further. And if you actually want to test out a proper action, you could do so as well, right? So for example, if you wanted to test sending an email to some people in your company to make sure you've got their email addresses correct and the email is going through, and you have your smart values correct, you could actually just add that to this rule as well. Go back to the issue, hit that button, and then you'll immediately get that email sent out. But today, we're going to look mainly at debugging smart values. So I've covered really the simplest case here, and this will work for most fields, in fact, on your issue. So with smart values, I would actually encourage you to just try them with like a little debugging rule like this. And in most cases, you can pretty much just use the field name in this issue.field name construct with the curly braces around it. And for most fields, this will work just fine. So most text fields, you know, things like summary, description, environment, issue key, and so on, you can literally just put in the field name and it will work. And this will work for custom fields as well. You can just type the custom field name, and we'll have a look at that in a second. But there are some smart values or fields in Jira, I should say, that are a little bit more complicated. So one of those fields is user fields. So for example, the reporter of an issue. So a reporter is not just a bit of text. A reporter is, you know, they have a full name, they have an email address, and they have lots of other attributes. So you might be wondering, how do we figure out the smart value to say display a reporter's name and their email address? So one way is really to just look in our docs in this available values section, and we could actually just look for probably email address, because that's what I'm trying to do. And immediately we jump to the section where you can see some of the attributes for a reporter. So in this case, I want to display their full name and the email address. So let's jump back to our rule, and we can simply use these smart values from our docs. And if I could type, this would be a lot easier. Reporter, email address. And then if we run this rule again, we should now hopefully get these replaced with John's full name and email address. And so if I jump back to the audit log of this rule now, you can see down here, it's replaced reporter.display name with his full name, and there's his email address. Feel free to email him with as many questions as you like about this webinar. I'm sure he'll appreciate that. Okay, so let's move into the probably most complex part of this webinar. And so for this bit, we're going to take a bit of a look at how the sausage is made behind the scenes. So what I'm going to show you next is how can you figure out how a smart value should look like if we don't have it in our docs. Now, I should reiterate that for 80 to 90% of users, you don't need to do what I'm about to show you. This is really just for those advanced power users out there that are wondering, how do smart values actually work behind the scenes, and how can I figure out how smart values work? Now, this might be useful if you've written your own add-ons for Jira and you have a really obscure custom field, for example, that's not standard in Jira that you want to access with smart values. So for this, we need to actually take a bit of a step back and look at how issues are represented internally. So to figure out what an issue's data representation looks like, we can actually go to Jira's REST API. So to do that, you can simply stick this special REST API to issue URL in front of your issue key. And when you access that, then you get this kind of strange looking data representation here. And I'll make this a little bit bigger so everyone can see it a bit more easily. So this is what's called the JSON representation of an issue. And you can already see here, there's sort of all the data about an issue is represented in this very raw and kind of strange format. Now, if you've done web development before, this will obviously look very familiar. If you haven't, and this is all kind of scary, feel free to ignore this part. We'll jump back to automation in the future. Now, one more thing I'll mention is that if you're trying this in your browser at home, most likely it won't look as pretty as this. I have a browser extension here that helps me make this all readable and look a bit nicer. And these are available for free in the Chrome Web Store. For example, we have the JSON view extension that we're using here in Chrome to make this JSON view render nicely. So how is this useful? So for example, let's take another look at our reporter field in here. So if I search for the reporter, then you'll see the internal structure of how a reporter is stored in Jira. And already we can see some of the attributes that we have access to in Smart Values. So for example, here's the display name and its value. And here's the email address and the value that we just showed you in the Smart Value before. Now, one thing that's really nice about this JSON view extension that I just showed you is that in the status bar down the bottom here, you can actually pretty much see the Smart Value. So we have this fields.reporter.displayName. So all you need to do to get the smart value for any field is replace fields with issue and off you go. So say if we wanted to include the time zone now in our smart value in the automation rule, we can just take that smart value from the status bar down the bottom, so that fields.reporter.timezone, and stick that into our automation rule. So if I jump back to this rule here, and let's say we wanted to show the reporter's time zone, then I can simply take that value from the JSON. And once I publish this and run this rule again, so let's jump back to our software one issue over here, to make my window a little bit bigger now, and debug this rule. Then if we come back to the audit log, we should now see that time zone value. And that is exactly that value over on the right here. So this is where smart values get their actual values from. Now, so far I've showed you a bunch of system fields and a more complex kind of user field. But you might be wondering, how does this work for custom fields? So what if you have like a custom select field? Well, luckily in this instance, I do have a select field here. So we've got a country field that we actually used in our first webinar, which is a simple drop-down field. So we have a bunch of different companies in here. Right now, this is set to Germany. So to figure out how to access this label, you can pretty much just look for the value in the JSON here. So if I search for Germany here, we can see that there's a custom field representation here in Jira. There is a raw ID for this custom field. And then there's the human readable label that we show on the view issue page, Germany. And then there's a custom field ID. So this is the ID that Jira uses internally to store this custom fields. But in the UI, it would show it as country. Now, the nice thing in Smart Values is you can either use this ID or you can use the human readable label. So let's go ahead and actually try that. So let's create another log action in our rule to try to print out the country. And I'm going to use a few different smart values here just to show you that you can use different ways to access this custom field. So we're going to access the smart value by the human readable label. We're also going to use the actual internal ID. And then we're going to use the value attribute, and we're also going to use the actual ID of the field. So if we jump back to our REST representation, there's a value and an ID attribute down here. So let's go ahead and save that and run it again. And if I come back to our audit log now, there's a few things happening here. So first of all, when we accessed the field simply by the human readable label, so issued or country, it was replaced with Germany, with the value. The same works if you use the custom field ID stored inside Jira. Once again, we get the human readable label. If you're accessing issued or country.value, we also get the human readable label. And then lastly, for the issued or country.id example, we just return the ID. Now you might be wondering, why did these first two actually return the human readable label as well? Because this is not a text field, it has attributes. Why did this actually return something? And that's because we've taken the liberty with smart values to try to make them smart internally and actually try to default to the value that we think most of our users want to see. So for most custom fields, we tried to automatically show you the human readable label. So for select fields, we show you the value attribute. So in this case, that ends up just rendering the country that you've selected. So what that means is that for most fields and smart values, you can actually simply try the field name in your smart value, and most of the time that will actually render something useful. But if it's a really special or weird kind of custom field that has a complex structure, then you may have to dive into this JSON view. So I'll just repeat once again. I've kind of showed you all the mystery meat inside the sausage today. I think I've really abused that metaphor as much as I can. This approach of looking at the JSON should not be necessary for 80 to 90% of our use cases. You should be able to simply check out our docs, or maybe even reach out to us in support and we can help you further. And also we will look into producing a smart values autocomplete or some kind of UI builder to help you build these smart values in future. We just haven't had time yet to implement this so far. But if you want to know and access the full power, then you need to, or you can go to the JSON representation of an issue in the way that I showed you today. All right. So far we've kind of used all of these smart values in a bit of a contrived way. I've just showed you how to debug them and how to access them. But let's actually maybe go ahead and create a rule that once again is actually useful and that you can actually implement at home in your Jira instances. And in this rule, we're going to use a few more features that smart values provide. So in our documentation, you may have seen these three sections on the left here. So we have these things called text functions, date functions, and math functions. And in this rule that we're about to create, I'm going to show you how to use each one. So these are useful if you want to further manipulate the values that you have already stored in your issues in Jira. So you can do things like calculate dates in the future, or you can manipulate text that you have stored in your issues, or you can even perform calculations. So for this last rule that I'm going to show you today, we're going to look at using a Jira as an invoicing system. So I'm going to create a new invoice. Now, with invoices, we have a cost associated. So let's say we want someone to pay us $100. And invoices also have a due date. In this case, let's say this invoice is already 2 days overdue. So it was actually due 2 days ago. And for this particular invoice now, we want to create an automation rule that sends out reminders to the reporters of these issues. We basically just want to add a comment to this, telling the reporter, hey, this invoice is now overdue. You need to pay it in 4 weeks' time. Otherwise, your cost will increase by, say, 10%. So let's go ahead and create such a rule. So for this particular rule, we're going to use a scheduled trigger. So this is a new trigger that we haven't really covered before. So this allows you to run automations on regular intervals, or you can even schedule them on specific times in your calendars. And what you can do is you can run a JQL search at that time. So today we're going to run a scheduled rule here every day, and every day we're going to look for issues where the due date is, has passed, so we're overdue. And then we're simply going to add a comment to all those issues or all those invoices that are overdue. So first, let's figure out how we can address the reporter in a nice and personal way using one of our text functions. So we already had a look at this smart value previously. So to get the reporter's full name, we can just simply go and use this issue reporter display name smart value. However, that would actually result in rendering hi John McKiernan, which isn't very personal, and we kind of want people to pay these invoices. So we should start off with a friendly tone. So we can use this special split function that we have available in our text functions in smart values to break the user's full name when we encounter the first space. And then we can use this special first smart value here to access the first part in the name. So just to give you a bit more information about this, if I jump into our documentation again and go into the text functions and search for this split function, then you can see it here with full documentation as well as an actual example that shows you what it would perform. So let's go ahead and actually try this out. So we'll call this notify overdue invoices and try it out. Now the nice thing with scheduled rules is that you can actually just run it straight away to try debugging it. So you don't have to wait until, for one day until this schedule kicks in. So this will now execute for all overdue issues. And in fact, I have a few here that I've created in earlier test runs of this webinar, but the one that we care about is this Web 34 issue that we just created before. And if I jump through this issue now, you can actually see here that we've replaced John McKiernan with just his first name, John, at runtime with this special split text function. So that's text functions. Let's have a look at how we can use date functions to manipulate dates. So as I mentioned, we want to tell the user that, in 2 weeks' time from the due date, this invoice will incur an additional cost. So let's go ahead and add that in. Can't really type, but that's okay. So we'll go and now calculate a date that's 14 days from the current due date. So we have this special plus days function here that's part of our date functions, and you can use this with any date field in Jira. So whether that's created date, updated date, or any custom date field that you have created. And this will now calculate a date in advance. So if I run this rule again, I jump back over to my issue, you can see here that it's actually calculated a due date that's 14 days from the current due date. And you can use date functions as well to format this date in different ways, any format that you like. And once again, if we jump into our date functions docs, there's plenty of examples in here on how you can use this, how you can format dates, and so on. Okay, now the last thing we want to do with this notification is we want to tell people that there's going to be an increased cost. So let's use one of our math functions to calculate that cost at runtime. So to start a math function, you simply need to create this little construct here with this hash equals. And then inside this block, you can perform any calculation you want. You can use it just like a calculator. So you can use issue fields, or you can just perform standard calculations. In this case, we want to increase the cost by 10%. So we're multiplying it by 1.1. And then we finish off with a nice little greeting. So let's go ahead and publish this and run this rule again, and then take a look at the comment that was added to our issue. So you can see down here now, we've got our final comment. It's added 10% to our original cost up here. We've got our expiry date, and we've got a nice personal way of addressing the user. And just to finish off with the math functions in our docs, this is once again showing you all the different examples. So you can just perform standard calculations with just numbers, or you can also perform calculations with any number field in your Jira instance. And there's plenty of examples in these docs as well. So we've gone quite deep today, and I know this has been quite a lot of advanced content. You know, it may take some time to absorb all of this. Once again, if you want to take a look at these rules, you can jump to our rule playground and take a look at all the rules that we created today. There'll also be a recording of this, so you can rewatch this later. Now, I might take a short breath and finish my coffee and hand back over to John, and then we have some time left to answer questions, I believe.
Hello again. So while Andreas finishes his cold coffee and takes a bit of a breath, we've had lots of really good questions in both the chat box and in the Q&A box. So Andreas is going to quickly look through all of those. Some of the easier ones, I thought just to give him a second, I can answer for you. So first of all, there's been a few +1s and thumbs up for that auto smart value builder or the autocomplete. Yeah, look, absolutely. That's something that's majorly on our roadmap. I think Andreas would agree that when himself and Nick started Automation for Jira, you know, the guiding principle was that anybody could use it, and it's absolutely true now. But if we can make smart values that bit easier, it really means that everybody can use it, even me. Second one we had, which is a straightforward one, so the debug rule that Andreas was using to check out smart values, can that be used in cloud? Yes, it can. So server cloud, no problem. It's a really good way for you to sort of see what smart values print out for you. And third, it's not so much a question as such, but I think it was Jack who was asking whether we have a user forum where users could seek help on their automation rules, kind of like in the Atlassian community. So I suppose there's a couple of different ways of answering that. So first of all, we do have, you know, in the Atlassian community, you can see that there's a section for Automation for Jira, and in there, customers can help each other. We go in and we answer all the questions that are asked there. And frankly, you know, you can see there's 523 posts there about Automation for Jira. I use it all the time. I find it quite handy. But we also have the playgrounds, and our ultimate goal with this is to enable people to go in, you know, put in rules by themselves. People can go in and correct them and so forth. Yeah, I mean, with regards to actually having a forum, like you suggest, we haven't got plans for it just yet, but it's a really good idea. So we'll definitely put it onto our list to have a chat about. And that's probably the best chance for me to hand back to Andreas now, and he's going to go through. We've got some, yeah, really good questions that need good answers, so it's a good time to hand over.
Great. All right, thanks, John. I'm going to just try to jump into some of the, I'm going to go through the Q&A questions that have come up first, and then maybe I can have a look at some of the chat questions as well. Okay, so we've got the first question here from Hal about how are permissions for manual triggers set up? For example, can you add permissions and which users in a project can invoke the manual trigger? Yep, absolutely. So with our manual trigger configuration, I can actually just show you this with a quick rule here. So if I open up the manual trigger again, then you get the choice of picking in a set of groups that can actually use this trigger. So right now, by default, any logged in user can see this trigger, but you can also restrict this to specific users as well. Okay, let's jump ahead to another question. So Mikhail asked a question about, so if you set up a rule with a trigger issue transitioned, and then you have some conditions like project ABC and issue type epic. If you have a lot of projects and thousands of users and there's thousands of issue transition events every day, is this going to add a lot of performance overhead to your Jira instance? Because obviously for every one of those events, we would have to run that check if the condition project A equals ABC matches. The answer is yes. So there is obviously a, automation rules aren't free. Like there is a cost to running a rule. In that case, the cost is for every issue transition event, you would be running a JQL search if you're using the JQL condition. So in that example, if you're just restricting to a single project, I would definitely recommend that you make this a project-specific rule, because then it becomes a lot cheaper for us to discard events from other projects, because we don't have to run a JQL search. We can simply check on, does the project in the event match the projects that are configured for the rule? And if it doesn't, we just stop execution. We don't have to run a JQL search, which is a lot more expensive. The other thing I'll say about that is that we do have service limits in place as well in automation for Jira, which are documented in our documentation, that are designed to protect your instance from overly expensive rules. So after some time, if there's a rule that's just executing way too much, then that rule will become throttled and it will not use up any more system resources until a time where the system is less busy. But yeah, you certainly have to be a little bit careful with your automation rules. There's definitely a cost associated with running a rule, but we've done quite a bit on our side to hopefully protect your Jira instance from those sorts of problems. There's a question from Robert around, is it possible to restrict a rule to a project group like service desk projects? So I'm guessing this is asking about, do we support project categories in our restrict to projects picker? At the moment, no, we haven't implemented that yet. I think there's an issue on our backlog for this, but to be honest, it's probably quite a long way away until we will get to implementing this. For now, you have to kind of pick all the projects from that drop down. I've answered the question from Hal around permissions for manual triggers. Mikhail asked a question around, can we restrict manual trigger to a specific issue type? So not a condition in the rule, but change it so it's only visible for certain types of issues. That's actually a good suggestion. I don't think we even have that in our backlog. So that's something I should probably raise after this webinar. But the answer is we don't support it yet. But yeah, it's definitely something we could maybe add to the manual trigger configuration that we've got in the background here. Yeah. There's a question from Felicia. I apologize if I'm butchering everyone's name. Any chance of implementing more advanced logic structures like loops or case switch statements? So that's a good question. So in terms of smart values, I think the answer is, so we won't add, I guess, more scripting type constructs to smart values. So we wouldn't add a switch statement in smart values themselves. And the reason is we don't want to become a scripting language. We think smart values are already quite confusing and difficult to use. And in fact, by adding smart value builders and so on, we're trying to make them easier. But what you will most likely see in future is, I guess, better UIs around performing tasks like looping and case and switch statements. So we have, in particular, 2 feature requests in our backlog right now to support mapping fields. So that would solve the case switch statement. So we see a lot of use cases where people go, if priority is high, then assign to user A. If priority is medium, assign to user B. If priority is low, assign to user C. So if we provided a nice UI to map all the different field values in one field to another, to field values in another field, and then you could use the result of that mapping later on in your rule, like that's probably more likely the way we'll go with this. And the same applies to loops. So we also see a lot of requests for, I want to iterate through all the components on my issue and then create a subtask for each selected component. And that's something we don't support at the moment, but we'll most likely introduce perhaps something similar to branching a rule for linked issues. Maybe you can branch a rule for selected field values, like on a component field or something like that. But we haven't fully thought through it, how this will work in practice. But that's most likely the direction that will go down, but it's probably quite a long way off. There's quite a few higher priority issues in our backlog at the moment. Okay, and then there's one last question from Mikhail in Q&A. Do you think about implementing action performed with a delay would be profitable? I'm not sure I fully understand this question. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure I understand this question. So it's talking about like, oh, so just adding a delay to a rule. Yeah, so we have, there's a feature request in our backlog around adding some way to delay rule execution by specified time that a user sets, whether that's 5 minutes or an hour or 5 days. It's something that comes up quite often. So it's something like almost like when, say, an issue is transitioned to a particular status, then you want to have an automation rule that kicks in a day later and sends a reminder email, perhaps, or something like that. There's a few tricky things around implementing that to make it performant at the scale that we're at, but it's definitely something we can solve. Once again, it's probably more on our longer term roadmap at the moment. Okay, whoa, there's a lot of questions coming in. So I've answered this one. Okay, so there's a question from Adam. Is there a way to create an automation rule to link several tickets created at the same time that pertain to one person or one event? For instance, we have formally create several tickets for different teams, set of permissions for a new user. We'd like to link those tickets together once they're all created. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand your use case. I mean, you can certainly create an automation rule that on issue created, if that issue matches a certain condition, you can then, with our related issues branch, search for related issues. So you can, you know, with a related issue branch, you can look for linked issues, but you can also just search for issues with a JQL search. So if I jump back to our related issues branch here, you can actually just look for other issues with JQL, right? And in this, you could actually use smart values even. So you could go, you know, where the priority is the same as the trigger issue priority or something like that. And then after this, on this branch, you could add a link issue action to link back to the trigger issue. So I think that should solve that use case. There's a question about, do we have the ability to automatically refresh issue data? So this, I presume, is about reloading the issue after we've performed an action. So the answer is we don't do that at the moment, mainly because there's no great APIs available from Atlassian. The reasons why it's actually not as trivial is because if we just reloaded the view issue page after we make a change, there might be a user actually, you know, doing something on that view issue page. Like they might be adding a comment or editing the issue. And if we just reload the issue while they're doing that, it will be kind of annoying. And unfortunately, Jira doesn't give us any APIs to where we can easily figure out, is a user actually interacting with the view issue page, or is it just sitting there? So it's kind of a bit tricky to just reload the view issue page automatically while a user might be looking at it. All right, I might have a quick look if there's any questions from, well, actually, sorry, there's 2 more questions here. So there's one from Joshua around for the integration with script runner. An admin can run an advanced script. I'm thinking the answer was, since the project lead can create a rule, project shouldn't be able to run. Yeah, okay, I think I know what this is. So script runner is, so we have an integration where script runner, if both automation for Jira and script runner are installed, then there's a script runner action that appears in automation for Jira that you can use to execute a script runner script. Now, that script runner action is only possible to be configured by global administrators. Project administrators are not allowed to configure script runner scripts. The reason for that is permissions. So the problem with script runner scripts, I guess, is that in that script, you can perform any action. And that means project admins could use that to escalate their permissions. So they could write a script that, deletes users, changes their own permissions so that they're now all of a sudden a global administrator. And so with the script runner action, we added a permission check that means that only global administrators are able to create scripts. We had a little bug around that in our UI, but that's been fixed since. So if you upgrade to the latest version now, global administrators can always edit the script runner action, even if you're in the project admin page. So we had a bug where if you were on the project admin page, then you couldn't edit script runner scripts. But yeah, it's a good question. Okay, last question in Q&A from Nick. So issue update list does not contain some of the fields to be set copied in Jira like target, start, and end. Can it be done via additional fields JSON? Yeah, that's a good question. So I didn't really cover the advanced fields JSON today. We only had so much time, I guess, to go through smart values. Pretty much any field, it should be possible to pretty much set any field in Jira through the advanced JSON. You will have to dive into how you would set those fields through the REST API. So effectively, if the field can be set through Jira's REST API, then you can use exactly the same format in our additional fields JSON. Feel free to reach out to us if you need more help with that. I don't know, is there any questions in chat, John, before I answer this last one?
Yeah, I think it'd be good to jump into chat.
Okay. Okay, let me jump into chat real quick. It's a little bit harder to figure that out. I can't at the moment even figure out how to open the chat window.
Get it more.
Chat, there we go. Okay, so chat's a little bit harder because it's obviously there's a lot of other interaction in there, which is great, but I actually need to scroll through the long list to find questions. So there's one question from Carmen. Can the audit log become really big and will that make Jira slower? I keep mine for 20 weeks. The answer is yes, the audit log can become big. We already have code in there, or we have a feature in there that automatically expires the audit log, and you can actually configure that yourselves as a global administrator. If you go to the automation for Jira configuration section, then you can just set the audit log to expire sooner. So if I actually really quickly show you that, so if I go to my global configuration here, you can actually set an audit log expiry of several weeks. In terms of will it make your Jira instance slower? Probably not, to be honest. Like, we've designed it so it will just grow and it's fine. The only thing it will do is that it will use up more space in your database because we have to store all that data somewhere. So if you're running out of space or anything like that in your database, then I would recommend to expire audit items. Okay, so we have a question from Bruno. We use Jira in our company and users need to create rules. The problem is that in order for them to be able to create edit rules, I have to give them admin level access. We also give them access only to automation. Yeah, so at the moment, I guess our permissions work in a way that to create automations, you have to either be a project administrator or you have to be a global administrator. We feel like automation is pretty powerful, and there is some, I guess, responsibility there. So we haven't really looked into, can we make this available for any end user, or maybe just users that are given permission. So right now we felt like project administrators would be a good sort of middle ground. So, that I guess project administrators are the ones that can create automation rules for their project. It's maybe something that we will revisit in future. Another question from Carmen. I think I've covered this one already, actually. If you have a big instance, want a global rule, should those be triggered much? Or any other global rule? Yep, so global rules will execute a lot if you have a big instance. So definitely recommend to create more project-specific rules if you can. But it also depends a bit on what your rule does. And as I mentioned, we have service limits in place. Let's have a look. There's a question from Haddon. Do you know if there are any plans to modify the rule scope permissions to allow selected rules to play outside of their scope? Right, and there are several rules which trigger in a specific project, but we need to impact many others. It's a little bit complicated because at runtime of a rule, we don't necessarily know what all the related projects will be. because you can, for example, configure a related issue branch with some JQL using smart values that then could result in any number of related projects. I mean, potentially we could add some sort of scope where we almost have two scopes per rule, where there's like a trigger scope and then there's an action scope. So you can define projects in which the rule will be triggered and projects in which the rule can perform actions. I'm not sure like how we would do that in the UI. It's probably not something that's come up too much yet. So for now, we'll probably stick with a single project scope, and you'll have to use conditions to limit which projects the rule will run in. That's the user forum question. Smart value builders. Does the debugging idea work in cloud? Yes, it absolutely does. So pretty much the same functionality that I showed in server today, all of this is available in cloud as well. There's a question around, can we send custom HTML emails or edit an email template? Not at the moment. It's definitely something that's come up. It's probably on our longer term roadmap at the moment. Yeah, at the moment you have to type the email out every time and include all the HTML. We don't have any templating mechanism at the moment. All right, maybe let's do like 3 or 4 more questions and then probably wrap it up, because I have a feeling people probably want to either go to sleep or get on with their day. Let's have a look. I'm just trying to find one in chat. There's one question from Jenny. Can smart values be used in the summary field? That's actually a good question. Yeah, absolutely. So you can use smart values pretty much anywhere in automation for Jira. So you can even type them in select fields and things like that. So if I actually jump very quickly into like an edit issue action, for example, then let's pick I actually have a good select field here. Well, I believe I can use the assignee field, hopefully. Nope, assignee field is not one that supports it, but let's try and find one. Labels, for example. So labels is a normal select field, but you can also use you know, smart values in here, for example. And you know, there's quite yeah, you can use it in pretty much, you can use smart values pretty much in any other field as well. Just trying to find some more questions. I think that's pretty much it, actually, jumping through the questions in chat. So I think we might actually wrap it up there. So thanks very much for tuning in, everyone. And I'll let John finish off with a few little housekeeping items.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, again, I just really want to thank everybody for attending. I know it's just gone past midnight in Ukraine. We've got somebody there in Quebec. It's the end of your day. You were mentioning in chat. So there's just a handful of questions that we didn't get through. So what I'll do is I'll try to reply to those. Equally, feel free to put through support. I think I've mentioned before that we all do support. Everybody in the team takes our equal share of support. So one of us will probably be answering your questions. Hopefully Andreas, not me. And again, I'll be sending a video to everybody of this recording tomorrow, so you can watch back. But other than that, we've got a last webinar in this series, which is in 2 weeks' time, which is about how to create rules for your Jira Service Desk, which is quite handy. So do make sure you register for that. I'll also include a link for that one. But otherwise, I'll leave you all to enjoy your sleeps and your glasses of wine or your coffee if you're in Australia. And yeah, we look forward to chatting to you again soon. Thanks for attending.
Thank you.